Hello and welcome to this bite-sized recording focused on feedback from the Summer 2025 Chief Examiner reports for the T-Level in Digital Business Services. This video will focus around feedback from core papers A and B and the ESP. So this video will be split into three parts. Firstly, we'll look at some question-by-question insights from core papers A and B. Then we look at task-by-task feedback from the Data Technician ESP, and then look at some teaching strategies for development. Firstly, we'll look at some of the overall trends across the core papers A and B. So there was an improvement in pass rates, with more students passing compared to previous series and better attempts at longer questions. There was an application gap, so students could recall terms but often struggled to apply them to contextualised scenarios. Evaluation and analysis remain weak, so responses were mostly descriptive and students often stated obvious pros and cons, for example, without reasoned judgments. At times there was superficial use of the stimulus data, so learners failing to integrate the unseen data or context into their answers. And technical topics were challenging, so things like computer science and project management content caused most difficulty. So now we'll look more deeply into the strengths and areas of development arising from core paper A, breaking the themes down by question. We'll start with section A, business context and culture. So firstly, looking at the areas of strength. So in question 2, students could identify risks such as fines and reputational damage. And on question 3, most recognised the unsafe use of digital technology. For example, they were able to state what the risks were and name mitigation techniques. On question 4, students were also able to name environmental factors, although relatively few understood how technology could impact the success of a new virtual reality service. The mixed areas are here now shown. So, for example, on question 3, when it came to explaining how to implement mitigation techniques or applying them to the context, the answers lacked depth. And on question 4, similarly, while many mentioned ICT equipment in relation to virtual reality, very few explain how the technology itself could affect business success. And the areas for development. So in question 1, students struggled with deeper application, for example, explaining cultural impacts of digitalisation, and how to implement change management or assessing stakeholder impacts of new technology, which were question 5 and question 10. And most of these responses stayed descriptive rather than evaluative. On questions 7 and 8, ethical analysis responses tended to be simplistic and descriptive. And now moving on to core paper A section B, which is digital environments and diversity inclusion. So areas of strength included things like question 11, where students were able to name benefits of diversity inclusion. Question 12, naming local area network hardware, for example, switch. And question 13, being able to name mail protocols correctly. On question 14, they could also recall protected characteristics from the Equality Act. In terms of mixed responses, on question 13, explaining the hypertext transfer protocol security was weaker, with most answers stopping at "it's secure" without explaining why. Similarly, on question 14, while many could identify bias in datasets as an issue, few could explain why that matters. And on question 16, students struggled to go beyond simply naming PC components without applying them to the gaming context. And then the areas for development included question 15, understanding virtual machines, question 18, assessing the benefits of digital inclusion, and on question 19, being able to apply cloud computing in context. These responses showed some recall, but without depth or application. Now moving on to core paper A section C, which is learning and planning. So strengths in this section included question 20, where students could name resources such as staff or money, and question 21, factors affecting validity or reliability of information. On question 23, they could also identify extended reality types like VR or AR. Some mixed areas included question 23, where students could give simple descriptions of how technologies might be used in logistics or name planning techniques. However, these answers often just copied the stimulus text rather than applying it. And that was clear in question 24 as well. And then the weaker areas for development. Question 22, the weakest performance was in project lifestyle stages, where many named benefits instead of stages. And in question 22 with quality management methods, and question 25 around design thinking. So even when students knew these terms, they struggled to apply them to the scenarios. And when asked to assess ineffective planning, most gave simplistic answers without weighing up evidence or making reasoned judgments. In summary for paper A, students could recall technology and basic definitions, but their application of theory to context, analysis and evaluation are the key gaps. Future teaching should emphasise scenario-based tasks, evaluation practice and scaffolding extended responses. So looking at this, we'll split this down to each section of core paper A. So in section A, around business context and culture, you could use things like quick-fire retrieval quizzes on areas such as risk and mitigation to keep recall sharp. Set up risk response flashcard activities where students need to mask risks such as fines or reputational damage with detailed mitigation strategies. You could use things like explain it twice tasks where students must explain mitigation first in simple terms, then in applied business terms using a scenario. And create case studies where students explore how a specific technology, for example VR, affects different aspects of business success. You could run role-play activities, simulating organisational change where students take different stakeholder perspectives. And it could be useful to have structured evaluation frames, for example, impact on cost, culture and customer, to scaffold stakeholder analysis. And teach digital culture through comparative examples. For example, how digitalisation changes workplace practices versus customer experience. And then for section B, digital environments and diversity and inclusion. You could use short peer teaching tasks where students explain protected characteristics or mail protocols to each other, reinforcing recall. Use why because chains. For example, things like HTTPS is secure because it encrypts data, which means to encourage explanation. Use mini investigations into dataset bias. For example, students could test small data sets for missing representation and reflect on the consequences. Provide live demonstrations or simulations of virtual machines and cloud platforms. And use business case studies showing how organisations adopt cloud services and allow students to debate the advantages and disadvantages. And finally, set up debate activities on digital inclusion, where groups can argue the benefits versus challenges, then reflect on real-world impacts. And then looking at section C, learning and planning. You could use scenario planning games where students must identify and justify resources needed for different project types. You could use applied project briefs where students design a logistics solution and must apply planning techniques, for example Gantt charts or critical paths. You could use visual timelines of project life cycle stages, then apply each stage to a worked scenario, for example when launching a new app. Run practical quality workshops, where students can quality check peer work and suggest quality assurance methods. And teach design thinking through design sprint activities where students brainstorm, prototype and test solutions to a simple problem. And scaffold evaluation by modelling how to weigh up evidence. For example, if planning is poor, what matters most, cost, time or quality, and really get students thinking about the evaluation behind their knowledge. And now we'll look at the key strengths and areas for development arising from core paper B. We'll start with section A on core paper B, which was around tools and testing. So in terms of the strengths, on question 2, students were confident in naming agile frameworks. On question 3, they could recognise presentation tools. And on question 4, they could identify the purposes of testing. So in summary, they could recall terminology and simple examples accurately. Mixed questions were examples when students were asked to explain how dashboards could be used in context. This is question 3, where they had to manage bookings in an entertainment venue. The answers were often superficial. Similarly, students could name collaborative tools on question 7, but struggled to explain how they would work across time zones. And on question 6, many could list steps of root cause analysis, but without showing how they applied the development of a mobile app. And then the areas for development. So it was noted on question 5 that flowcharts were particularly weak, most students giving generic statements such as they make information easier to understand, rather than explaining why this method is effective or how it helps a specific audience. And explanations of testing on question 8 were also limited. Answers rarely went beyond surface level descriptions. And now core paper B, section B, which was legislation and security. So in terms of strength here, most students could name organisations such as International Organisation for Standardisation on question 11, and could identify consequences of non-compliance such as fines and reputational damage, which was question 10. They could also correctly name spam types on question 12. So again, these recall-based questions were answered well. In terms of mixed outcomes, when asked about threats on question 13, such as ransomware, students often described the threat but didn't explain how it would damage an e-commerce website. Similarly, on question 14, codes of conduct were described in generic terms, for example, sets expectations, but not linked to the context in the stimulus. And then those areas for development were that many general data protection regulation answers were oversimplistic, often just stating protecting data without saying how or why, and that was question 9. And then in question 16, the Freedom of Information Act was also weak, with answers limited to generic risks rather than showing understanding of what the law requires councils to do. Risk mitigation strategies on question 17, such as free USB-enabled printer, were mentioned but not explained in context. And then finally on question 18, internet security answers often lacked analysis and evaluation, so students could name processes but didn't show how they would benefit the hotel business in the scenario. And now looking at core paper B, section C, the data and digital analysis section. So again, starting with the strengths, on question 19, students were confident in naming decomposition diagrams, and on question 20, identifying sources of external data. The mixed responses included talking about extended reality on question 21, which was sometimes explained well, particularly when linked to training in realistic environments, but this was not consistent. On question 22, computational thinking process was also mixed, with many students confusing them with algorithm characteristics. And then the areas for development. On question 23, the application of algorithms was a major weakness. So many could describe characteristics but not show how algorithms would be used to analyse grades or admissions data. On question 25, few students understood what an information system is or how it differs from databases. The entity relationship model on question 26 was poorly understood, with many confusing it with diagrams. And then help desk data was often recognised as useful for facts, but students didn't explain how data would drive that process. And database resource considerations, for example, cataloguing artefacts in a museum, were also poorly answered with limited understanding of requirements. So therefore, from these findings, here are some suggested teaching strategies for core paper B. So for the tools and testing section, you could deliver hands-on testing workshops using real or simulated data and practice interpreting dashboards and creating flowcharts using online tools. And you could use root cause analysis activities, for example, using fishbone diagrams. And then for legislation and security, you could use a data dilemma case study to apply GDPR decisions. You could create cyber incident simulations where learners need to plan mitigations. And you could also map ISO controls to real or mock business processes. Might be useful to also hold risk mitigation debates, for example, around things like the safe use of USBs. And then for data and digital analysis, you could set data insight challenges using real-world data sets. Then you could also embed computational thinking reflections after digital tasks. And to help with this, you could scaffold extended response writing with things like peel or chain frames and exemplars. Let's move on now and explore the key themes arising from the data technician ESP assessments. Again, we'll explore the main strengths that students demonstrated, as well as the areas where challenges remain. So on the ESP task 1, this was the project plan and email. So in terms of project planning, many students produced recognisable Gantt charts, including tasks, timeframes, and in some cases dependencies and contingency. However, many Gantt charts did lack essential features, again, such as dependencies, dates, or contingency time. And also, some students used a waterfall approach incorrectly, which showed limited understanding of concurrent task planning. Moving on to the professional email. So most emails demonstrated improved English and a professional tone, with a better understanding of structure and formatting. However, emails did often miss key requirements, particularly in terms of risks, stakeholder impact, and mitigation strategies. And a few students didn't format their evidence as emails or failed to address all of the required elements. Then at the bottom here, in terms of contextualisation, stronger students planned realistic timelines aligned with the project brief. However, contextualisation was inconsistent and some responses were generic rather than specific to the Popper-Sprague's brief. In response to the key areas for development for Task 1, some suggested teaching and learning strategies are as follows. You could use Gantt chart workshops where students learn through hands-on modelling how to use project tools, for example, Microsoft Project, Gantt Project or Excel, and get them to compare completed versus incomplete charts, highlighting things like dependencies, overlaps and contingency. Use plenty of real-life scenario practice, such as business briefs, and get students to plan overlapping tasks within given timescales. And in terms of professional emails, you could set up clinics where peer review checklists are used to ensure structure, for example, introduction, rationale, risks and impact and recommendations. And include exercises on writing for purpose and for professional tone. And also use context linking exercises where each student would be required to include one explicit link to a business scenario in every paragraph of the email. So now moving on to the ESP task 2, which was the data cleanse and analysis task. So for task 2A, which was identifying sources of data, stronger students could identify relevant internal and external data sources and explain how these supported project planning. Some provided clear links between data selection and the Popper-Sprague's goals in terms of menu development and delivery planning. Areas for development here were that many students listed too many sources instead of selecting the most relevant, and some focused on how to process data, not which data was actually needed. And responses often lacked depth and justification for why particular data was valuable. For task 2B, which was the data cleansing and identity relationship diagram, The key strengths here were that students could effectively identify and correct errors, remove duplicates and normalise data. There was evidence of improvement in ERD presentation, more diagrams were correctly formatted and recognisable. In terms of areas for development, many students identified errors but did not actually perform a full data cleanse, and some only cleansed part of the data set or one spreadsheet. And often the ERDs were incomplete, missing some primary or foreign keys or showing limited understanding of relationships. Now moving on to the data analysis. So stronger students were able to demonstrate confident use of spreadsheet tools, things like pivot tables, charts and dashboards. And there was a good selection of relevant data to create new data sets with clear visualizations linked to the project goals. And areas for development here included some students producing non-functional dashboards, for example pivot tables or slices that didn't work, and many included irrelevant data not linked to the business aims. Also, the presentation of data lacked clarity at times, for example multiple charts without explanation or alignment to the brief. And then lastly, the email to the manager. So stronger students here were able to write clear summaries of cleansing and analysis steps and link their recommendations to the business outcomes. In terms of development, many emails were descriptive rather than analytical, focusing on steps taken rather than insights gained. And recommendations were often missing or generic, so for example, improve service instead of something like add vegetarian options based on demand data. So following this, here are some suggested teaching and learning strategies for Task 2. Data relevance exercises. For example, present students with mixed data sets and ask them to justify which are essential, useful or irrelevant. And you could use prioritisation tasks with ranking grids where students order data sources by usefulness to the project brief. Context-driven data briefs, so build practice assessments where students must select and justify 3 to 4 key data sets linked to a specific business decision. And use why this data type prompts. This would require each selected data set to be accompanied by a justification paragraph linking it to project aims. Data cleansing practice, so use small flawed data sets for students to clean step by step, explaining each correction, and encourage students to document cleansing steps, for example using before and after screenshots. Visual modelling, so you could display examples of fully functioning versus incomplete ERDs and discuss what makes them effective. Functional dashboard practice. This is where students could test and troubleshoot pivot tables and slices to ensure full functionality before submission. A data relevance challenge. So you could provide a range of data sets and ask students to build only one that directly answers a project question. Analytical commentary exercises. So pair each chart or table with a short written explanation of what it shows and why it matters. And you could use what does this tell us prompts. So embedding these into practice tasks helps students move from displaying to interpreting data. And practice insight writing. So you could use sentence stems like the data shows that, therefore Papa Sprague's should in this context. And use peer feedback where they would review sample emails and discuss which ones show clear business reasoning versus simple description. And now we look at the feedback for tasks 3 and 4. So task 3 was the presentation of research findings. In terms of strengths here, many students created professional, visually engaging presentations suitable for business audiences, and there was a strong use of digital features such as charts, transitions, themes and speaker notes. High-performing students also linked their data analysis to stakeholder impacts and project recommendations. In terms of areas for development, presentations often did cover all task elements, although superficially, lacking analysis and contextualisation. and many included charts without explanation or generic references to stakeholders and risks. And some omitted key elements of the brief or failed to relate their findings to the project aims. Then in task 4, the evaluation and reflection. Here, stronger students demonstrated meaningful reflection, linking performance to project aims. And some identified specific areas for improvement and proposed relevant CPD actions. In terms of development areas, many reflections were descriptive, summarising tasks without analysis. And very few students linked the reflections to the project outcomes or the skill development needs. Some overestimated their performance, showing little critical evaluation. So some teaching and learning strategies to support with delivery of tasks 3 and 4 are as follows. So starting on the right hand side here, formulaic slide framework may help students. So for example, on each slide they might be required to explain the concept, present a finding, apply to a scenario and recommend next steps. You could use stakeholder mapping activities where students would need to identify a stakeholder's interest, potential concerns and mitigation strategies. Make sure to practice presentations where students deliver findings to peers to simulate professional presentational delivery. And use data storytelling workshops, so teach students how to narrate insights from charts rather than simply describing the data. And on the left-hand side for task 4, you could consider structured reflection frameworks, so using Gibbs reflective cycle or what, so what, now what to guide depth in reflection. Model reflection by comparing weak versus strong examples and highlight where students move from description to evaluation. Personal CPD planning, so have students identify 2 to 3 skills to develop and how this would improve their future projects. And reflective prompts, so you could use things like how did your performance affect project success, or what would you do differently next time to support students in their reflection. Now that we've looked at each task in detail, there were some overarching themes across the core exams and the ESP that were noted by the chief examiners. So whilst the examiner noticed that digital skills were improving, the presentation of evidence still needs tightening. So for example, some files were missing, unreadable or split across multiple pages, especially Gantt charts and spreadsheets. And students need to ensure their work is accessible and correctly formatted. File conversion issues resulted in loss of quality or missing speaker notes when converting to PDF. Providers also need to check uploads carefully to avoid missing or blank documents and encourage students to make those same checks. Evidence should flow logically between tasks and be contextually linked to the brief, treating the ESP as one ongoing project rather than separate parts. Students rarely referred back to previous work across the 5 tasks. Finally, professionalism matters, so better use of digital tools such as charts, slides and formatting was observed, though still uneven. Clear formatting, labelled evidence and appropriate language all contribute to higher quality submissions. So in summary, across the core exams and the ESP, the following are teaching priorities. So firstly, shifting students from recall through to application and then to evaluation using structured practice. And in the ESP, treating it as one project improves coherence, progression and evaluation. And secondly, increase the use of scenarios, simulations and role play to make abstract ideas more concrete. Students must link evidence directly to the business brief to demonstrate applied understanding. You could use writing frames and evaluation prompts to push beyond description. In the ESP, missing or unreadable evidence reduces marks, so practice with submission checklists and scaffolded frameworks. And then think about how to embed applied project management and IT practice into lessons to strengthen weaker technical areas. For the ESP, tools must function accurately to gain credit, so it could be useful to provide software troubleshooting workshops. And finally, the next few slides will highlight our support offer and additional resources which you may find useful. So remember that the support doesn't stop after today's session. There's a range of materials available to help you and your students. On the NCFE qualification page, you'll find the Chief Examiner reports, student exemplar work and downloadable schemes of work with free teacher materials. There are also recorded CPD sessions on our YouTube playlist, which you can revisit anytime, and upcoming live events are listed on the NCFE T-Level Training Events page. And before we finish, I'd really appreciate your feedback on today's session, so you can scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link to complete a very short survey. This input really helps us refine the training and make sure future sessions are as relevant and useful as possible. Thank you for listening to this session today. I hope you leave with some clear practical ideas to support your students in achieving their best.